You are in for a real treat inside this episode because my friend Seth Silvers is one of the most knowledgeable podcast experts I know. He helps to oversee the strategies behind some of today's top podcasts, like the Patrick Lencioni podcasts and the Hormozi podcasts. And he's here in the studio with me today to talk about how the days of easy podcasts with low-quality sales content are done, and the steps that you need to take as a host to reposition your show so you can stand out in an increasingly crowded marketplace, gain a competitive edge, and just say no to bad content and subpar guests. That's all coming up next, so stick around. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Seth, what's up? I am so pumped for this conversation, like you don't even know.
Thanks for the invite. I feel like we definitely align on a lot of things of how we see podcasting, so I'm looking forward to getting to jam about it.
100%. That's why I just want to jump right in and kick off with this and ask you, do you feel like we're starting to see a major decline in podcast quality because hosts are just letting subpar guests on their shows and or not really taking things seriously when it comes to mastering the craft of being a podcast host?
I think that we've seen a lot of it in the last couple of years, and I think we're starting to recognize what it is and what's happened. And so, I mean, I believe podcasting is super, super unsaturated. Like, I think it's still very early, and there's plenty of data to support that and all that stuff. But I think it is saturated with really crappy content, particularly coming from businesses, and particularly in like kind of the nonfiction interview show style. And so I think that for the last couple of years, a lot of businesses, a lot of people have been like, oh, I'm going to start an interview show. We saw some of like the early interview shows that crushed it, and I've been doing it for 9-10 years. And so I do think a lot of people got into interview-based nonfiction shows. And then now I think we're looking back and we're looking at like all the shows that are out there and that are popping up in search results and popping up inside podcast players. And where people are beginning to realize like, this is not super, super good. And for me personally, like it's caused me to reanalyze how quickly should we launch? How much effort should hosts put in? Like some of these things where I think for a while I went through a season of like, yeah, as quick as possible, as fast, like get the show out. It's better to have the show than to not have the show. Some of these thoughts that now I'm starting to reanalyze like what's actually the best there.
Yeah, I'm with you. I feel like a lot of clients who have come to us more recently will actually complain about the format of an interview-based show and not like bash it or anything like that, but just be like, I want mine to be different because I feel like there's so many interview shows out there. It's been done before. My topic is really no different than the number of other podcasters who are teaching the same thing. So they think, okay, how can I make this different? How can I make this interesting and exciting? And I'm curious to hear your take because I think there's a line there as well where our listeners so used to listening to these interview-based podcasts that then to suddenly to go off the map and do something completely different or opposite or wild and crazy might actually be a turnoff as well. Or do you think there's room right now in the space for more creative output?
Yeah, I think there's definitely room to be creative. And I think there's a lot of people that want to podcast. They want to have a podcast, but they don't really want to be creative with it. I don't think that they want, there's a lot of hosts, I don't think that they want to actually ask the question of, is my show unique? And what would it look like for me to bring something unique to the space? We can look at YouTube as, you know, podcasting in many ways, even though it predates YouTube, I think in many ways, content wise is behind YouTube in innovation. And so we rewind a decade into YouTube, you know, even look at like, okay, when Mr. Beast was starting, when Marquez Brownlee was starting, like their videos were not super crazy, highly produced, super creative, but they were creating content. And so you look at the creators that were dominating YouTube 10 years ago versus the creators that are now. And not to say one is better than the other, it's just different. As the space gets more crowded, as there's more creators have to look at the space and say, how can I stand out? And so I think for a lot of shows that we help to launch and help to produce, at the beginning days, it was like, okay, we're just going to do interview shows. And I think now we're taking longer to launch the shows. We're spending more time getting to know the host. We're spending more time in kind of competitive analysis, actually looking at what are you going to bring that's actually unique? Because unfortunately, just interviewing somebody and kind of just asking like the same old questions, having a 25-minute interview is not really cutting it anymore. That's actually why I shut my first show down, The Small Business Storytellers. It's still out there. You can still find it. But I got to the place where I was like, this is not unique. Like me having 25-minute interviews with business owners asking, hey, tell me your story. And then, at the end, hey, where do you want to send people? Like that was no longer unique. It was when I started it. And so then for me, it was like, I'm not going to put this much time into something that isn't providing a unique take. And also, I wasn't necessarily in the place time wise to be able to put time into creating something more unique. So, yeah, I think there is a ton of room to provide something more unique. And I think in the next couple of years, I imagine that we'll see a lot of really creative formats come out of podcasters simply sitting down and saying, what's something unique that I can bring to the market?
I want to talk about mastering your craft as a host because I feel like this is a really important part of this conversation. But before we do that, let's talk about competitive analysis because this is something that people don't think about when they go to launch a podcast. I had a conversation with someone this morning and they're like, well, this is our topic. This is what we do. This is what we teach. This is why we want a podcast. But they're not actually considering how their podcast stacks up against other podcasts. They're not considering how their podcast even looks against other podcasts. They're not considering some of the elements that actually draw a listener's attention to a podcast to begin with. And so they're already setting themselves up to fail without even realizing it. And it breaks my heart because they might have a great message. They might have a message a lot of people need to hear, but they're getting overlooked in the podcast space. So can you break down that competitive analysis for us and what should hosts be looking at and the lens through which they should be looking at their podcast in terms of other podcasts that also exist in their niche?
Yeah, I think you got to pay attention to two things. You got to pay attention to what is there and you got to pay attention to what is not there. I think sometimes listening to what is not said or watching what is not there is just as important as seeing what is actually there. Just got back from London a couple of weeks ago at the podcast show. YouTube did a ton of, they did a ton of sessions. We were listening to what they were saying. And we were also listening to what are they not talking about? Like that's almost just as important. And so I think when you're looking at the competitive analysis for us, like just on a super practical level, we are usually going to be going in and looking at the top like 20 to 30 shows on YouTube and on podcast players. They're usually going to be a little bit different. What defines top? Yes, that's subjective, like everybody's going to look at that a little bit differently, but kind of trying to get a good idea of what are the top shows in your particular area. And we're going to look at content structure. Like usually what we do is we kind of narrow that down to a top 10 on each platform. And then that's where we're listening. We're looking at the content structure. We're looking at the packaging. So like from a visual standpoint, do all these shows, are they just lucky to be in the top 10? Like, is there anything actually unique? Are they absolutely crushing it visually? If they're all like clearly investing in production or investing in design and their packaging and their thumbnails are incredible, you probably need to up your standard a little bit. But I think beginning to look at who are the top players. And then I think another important thing is really looking at outside of podcasting, looking at your competitors. If you're a business, like from a brand perspective, who's your competition? Don't even think about if they're podcasting or if they're on YouTube. What media are they creating? Because that media is likely something that if you guys have crossover audience that they're going to see. So that's really like, those are the things that we want to see. And on that top 10, we're looking at, do they have an offer or a call to action? How are they inviting their guests to take action? And then from there, you can really make a position of, okay, is there somebody that we want to emulate? And that's okay. Like it does it. You don't have to say, okay, what can I provide that's totally unique from everybody? But likely looking at it and saying, okay, we want to emulate this. Maybe after all of that, you realize what your original plan was is totally fine. And you're like, okay, good. I just feel more confidence in this. But most people aren't actually looking at that. They're just putting out what they think should go out. And it's kind of the question, like in the business world of, are you asking your customers what they want? Or are you just deciding in like a boardroom, like, here's what we think they need? Those are two very different conversations. So I think with a competitive analysis, the most important thing is to actually spend some time doing research. If you do an hour, that's better than 0. If you do 10 hours, that's better than 1. You're going to get value out of having a better idea of what else, when your listeners are looking for content around your niche, what else are they coming into contact with? And will yours actually stand out? Will it stand out quality-wise, visually, content-wise? So those are some of the things that we look at when we're looking at competitive analysis.
Yeah. And on that note too, about like, what do your listeners actually want? Sometimes I think as hosts, we can give even too much credit to that because a lot of times listeners don't know what they want. And as the expert, it's your job to bridge that gap and to see, okay, here's the gaps in the marketplace. Here's what I can fill. Here's what I like what's happening in the marketplace and what I might want to emulate and do differently. Here's what I think my listeners need. Here's what they're telling me they want. But here's also what I, as the expert, know that they need. And it's kind of like looking at all the different facets of this and really bringing that under a podcast umbrella to say, okay, here's how we're going to position this show. And like you said, not a lot of people take any time to do this, and a little time is better than none. But for someone who really wants to get that competitive edge and up their game, right? Like we can do the competitive analysis, but what about you as the host and how you show up? Because for me, when we're looking at some of the top shows, a lot of what sets them apart is the host's ability to host the podcast. So can we talk about mastering your craft? What does that mean? Let's break that down.
You made a really good point, because sometimes in this journey, there's a difference between maybe the audience that you have and the audience that you want. You and I both come from some version of a faith background. And so for me, there's this sense of like, who do I actually feel like a sense of calling to serve? And that's like a real thing. And that's not always going to be the people that happen to be in front of you. And so then, like you said, sometimes there's going to be a dissonance there where you realize, okay, maybe responding to the audience that I currently have after producing a bunch of random content for 3 years, maybe that's not the audience I need to listen to. Like, how do I serve the actual audience that I feel a sense of calling or feel a sense of gumption to serve? From the host perspective, I think one of my favorite people that does this super well, he's been on your show, is Jordan Harbinger. I talked with him a bunch in London, and I told him, I said, I recommend all of my clients listen to your show. And I told him, I said, the content is good. Like, content is interesting. Good job on the content. I don't listen to every episode that he does, but I'll listen to a handful a year. But I tell my clients to listen to how he does it. I look at people like Jordan Harbinger, I look at people like Tim Ferriss. It is very evident that they are actually working to hone and master the craft rather than looking at podcasting just as a tool. So I think we're kind of entering this phase where, from a host perspective, the hosts that are really going to be successful in podcasting, they're going to have to look at it more as a craft to be mastered than just like a tool to be used for other business purposes. And I think that what we will realize is when we begin to master the craft, then that usually ends up working out really well for whatever business purposes we are podcasting for. So I think a few super practical things. One is actually listening to your content. It sounds really simple. A lot of people are afraid to listen to your episodes and your own content. I should listen back to the interviews. Like, if I'm mostly on shows as an interview guest, I should be listening back to those things. I think that's one really basic, really important thing that I think hosts can do. The other thing is just actually taking time to prepare for an episode. So for me, it's pretty natural to sit in a conversation like this, and pretty natural to interview somebody. And I remember in college, I was in an advanced public speaking class, and I gave a talk, and I remember writing the talk at breakfast while I was at the cafeteria, and then going and delivering the talk at class. And I was like, I'm sure I'll be fine. And so I gave it, and based off of my very biased opinion, I was like, I think I was in the top 3 or 4 in the class today. It was a 5-minute talk. So I was I think I got an A. I definitely know I did better than other people, as a 19-year-old compares himself to everybody. And my teacher actually came back, and they gave me a C- and then asked me to stay after class. And she came to me, and she totally called my bluff. She's like, you wrote that this morning. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, your talk was better than other people's, but it wasn't good for you. That moment really stuck with me, because it was oh, this is something that's very comfortable. And I think back to that story often when podcasting and when working with clients, because even if it comes very natural to interview, taking time to prepare, taking time to step back, actually write custom questions for that person, actually be listening in the interview, not just thinking about your next question, but thinking about how you can respond and go deeper to what they just said. It really comes down to if you just take a little bit more time to actually prepare for your episodes, and you don't just smash them between meetings in your day and just kick it out just like the last one, your conversations are going to be more engaging. Your retention rates are going to be better for your listeners. It's going to trickle down into, I think, almost every aspect of the podcast.
I'm laughing because in college, I used to do the same thing. I had this public speaking class, and like literally that morning, I'm like jotting my outline down, and I'd go and I'd deliver, and I'm like, this is great. And then I took that approach with me through my business in the early days of my business, anytime I would give a workshop or a webinar when I started my podcast. And honestly, Seth, for a lot of times, it was my ego running the show or stealing the show, I should say, because I was like, I've got this. I'm good at this. People tell me I'm good at this. So therefore, I don't need to put in the time and energy and effort that other people might need to put in to get a great interview. It's a natural ability. And because of that, it became a huge blind spot as well for the podcast. So I love that you bring this up. And I'm curious. So when you're coaching a client, like what is the process that you tell them, okay, here's how we want you to prepare for an interview. Here's what we recommend. And how long does that preparation usually take? Because I think for some people, they're like, oh my gosh, it's going to take me 2 hours. I don't have 2 hours to prepare for that. I know for me, it doesn't take me that long, but I'm curious to hear what you would say.
Yeah, I think a little bit of it is person to person. And then I think it also comes into the filtering process of who you're allowing as a guest on your team. So we're starting to encourage shows that we work with to be okay adding more friction to the process. There's disproportionate amount more people that are wanting to get on podcasts than podcast hosts right now. And so I think adding some friction, making it a little bit clunkier, a little bit harder to get on a show so that, you know, if somebody goes through these steps, they really want to be on the show. They're really going to be a valuable guest. And then you can make some of that prep a lot easier. So for one of our clients, he prefers to talk about stories over principles. And so in his intake form, he asks people, can you give me an overview of 3 stories? Like give me the story, give me the names, then we can talk about related to this idea. And a lot of people won't do it. In one time we had somebody that went through it and they responded back and they just said like, oh no, I'm okay. I'm ready to roll. That was like what they said. I'm ready to roll. And so we talked about it as a team. We actually ended up canceling the interview. They were on paper a really qualified guest, but it was like, well, they're not willing to go into this process, which to me says that they're coming solely with their own agenda, not with the host's agenda. And so I think there's some things that you can do in the intake form or however you're bringing in guests. You know, you and I had some email exchange before this of just like, what things are we passionate about? What things are we talking a lot about? What things are like on our mind in podcasting, and having some dialogue about that. And I think that just creating time and putting some things in the process to be able to do that helps a lot. I personally, I recommend if you're not going, I know Jordan Harbinger, like he's reading the books, he's spending hours prepping for interviews and you can hear it in his interviews. I think for busy business owners, being willing to spend at least 30 to 45 minutes before an interview, getting to know your guest, getting to know their company, getting to know like, what do you really want out of this? I think that's going to make an exponential difference because most people just don't do that.
Yeah. I spend about an hour minimum. I'll go look at that person's website and their recent social media posts. And I know you, Seth, and I like you and I trust you. And so our email exchange was actually not the norm for us. And we're in the process of redialing in our guest intake for this exact reason, because it's easy for you and I to sit here as experts in the podcasting industry to be able to say, okay, what hasn't been talked about? What other angles can we talk about? Shoot off some ideas for me. Yes, let's do that. And then have a really great conversation around it because this is our craft. This is what we do. Mm-hmm. But for a guest that's coming on cold, and that I don't know that person. I've never met them. I've never had a conversation with them. I've never hung out with them in person or in a Zoom room. I need to know that person so that I can interview that person well. And that's going to take some time. So I love that you shared this in just the practical way that people can walk away from this and really just think about, okay, what is my process for interviewing guests right now? What's my process for vetting guests? And what's my process for interview preparation? And if you did nothing else from anything that we talked about today, and you just put a little more time and a little more focus in that, you would start to give yourself over time a competitive edge because most hosts, like you said, are not doing this.
Yeah. And I think just not hesitating or being like nervous about adding more friction. Like you would probably, if you added more time, if you did less interviews, but as the host put more into those interviews, it would probably benefit your brand more than having a higher quantity of like lower depth interviews. And I think people are afraid to mess with their schedule and mess with their consistency. And it's like people want quality conversations. And it's our responsibility as the hosts to actually bring that. It's not the guests. Like that is our job as the hosts to lead them through that. And that requires like stepping up to the plate and requires like taking some responsibility as a host. And I personally think hosts need to spend more time on their podcasts.
Yeah, 100%. And you helped to oversee some of the podcasts of some of today's top authors and thought leaders around the world. I mean, Patrick Lencioni and Alex Hormozi. And I know your whole approach, Seth, is about serving the listeners first. And it's one we totally philosophically align on. I agree with that wholeheartedly. So if we were to just wrap up this conversation and zoom back out for a second, what's one way that we as hosts can start pushing for higher standards across the board in the industry? Or do you think, is that something that happens from the top down where it's like as the industry changes, then the hosts will kind of follow suit? Or is that something that, no, it's more grassroots, it's bottom up, and we as the host need to take a stand for it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really simple. I think you need to listen to your show and ask yourself the question and answer honestly, would you listen? Like, would you listen? And if you heard that episode that you just listened to, would you share it with somebody? Would you actually make time in your schedule the next week to listen again? Because if the answer is no for you, then it's probably going to be no for your audience.
So true. And this is why I'm really excited that you're sticking around with us, Seth, for another episode where we're going to flip the mic and talk about 4 reasons why your podcast guesting strategy isn't working like you thought it would, and how to improve your craft as a podcast guest to yield a greater return in terms of listener to lead conversions. So if you're listening right now, then don't go anywhere, because that's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.